Thank you. And now let me tell you why we are so happy to present Jim today, not only because we consider him a good friend, we admire his work, and because he is a great example about walking the talk regarding collaboration. So Jim Tamm is a former judge and an expert in building collaborative workplace environments, with 40 years of experience in the field of alliance building and conflict resolutions. As a senior administrative law judge for the state of California for years, Jim mediated more than 1,000 employment disputes. His legal decisions have impacted national labor policy in the US, and he has authored training materials that have been published in 14 languages now. The California Senate, the California Assembly, and the California Public Employment Relations Board have all honored Jim for his work building more collaborative employment environments. His most recent book, Radical Collaboration, co-authored with Ron Luyet, was on Amazon's top seller list for workplace, organizational psychology, collaboration, and negotiation books for most of the past 16 years now. He's a former law professor and is currently on the faculty of the International Management Program of the Stockholm School of Economics, the Management Education Program at NASA, and the Leadership Academy of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. Jim has diverse client base of international organizations ranging from the United Nations, NASA, Toyota, and Boeing, and the US Army and Navy, to universities, financial institutions, pharmaceuticals, and toy companies. So please turn mics off, be as present as you can be. It's worth it, even with your camera on if you want, if you can. Take notes and enjoy. Welcome, Jim. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Consultoria Mas for inviting me. This is a topic that I enjoy talking about very much. Let me give just a little more background about my experience working with unions and management in trying to build more cooperative relationships. As a judge, when I was a judge for the state of California, we kept seeing the same labor management relationships come through our system with a lot of litigation, and we were trying to figure out why some of the relationships were so conflicted and so adversarial and were always in trouble and always had litigation, while others operating in the same environment, drawing from the same labor pool, represented by the same unions, didn't have as much conflict. Because these organizations that were in a lot of conflict, the labor management relationships that were in a lot of conflict, they were costing the state of California a huge amount of money, not just for judges' salaries or courtrooms, but primarily for lost productivity. So a small group of us within the state of California got together, and we got a big grant from the Hewlett Foundation, from Hewlett Packard and a couple other smaller foundations. And we did a lot of research trying to see what the difference was and then what we could do about it to improve the collaborative skills of those labor management relationships where they were in conflict all the time. Then we went out and we went looking for the most screwed up, dysfunctional, highly conflicted relationships that we could find to test this training on. We put together a training program to try and teach them how to be better at collaboration. And we were wildly successful at that. We reduced the amount of measurable conflict, things like number of unfair labor practice charges, or the number of mediations, number of requests for fact finders. by almost 67% in 100 organizations. It just saved the state of California so much money in the cost of conflict that the state legislature created a nonprofit foundation to keep offering this to public sector organizations in California. And I was invited to be not only one of the original faculty members, but one of the designers of that program because I had a lot of experience mediating labor disputes and employment disputes, because that was my primary jurisdiction, was conflict in the workplace. So I think not only have I mediated a large number, but I think I've mediated more school district labor strikes than anybody else in the United States. So I had a fair amount of experience doing that. So much of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from my experience working with labor unions and management groups, trying to teach them how to be more collaborative. I'm not going to be talking specifically about the program that we did with the labor management groups back in California, though. At least I'm not intending to. If people have questions about it later on during the question and answer period, I'm happy to answer any questions about it. But what I'm going to be focusing on today are what are some tips if you're just heading into negotiations right now. What are some things that you can do? What are some tips that you can do that may improve the relationship during your upcoming negotiations? I understand a lot of you are heading into negotiations fairly soon. And also, from what I understand from Nicole and Paul, most of you are representing management or HR officials or managers. There are some other top managers in organizations that are not focused on HR, but anyway, most of you come from the management side. But if any of you did bring any of your union counterparts with you, or if you have any union counterparts that have signed on, everything that I'm telling to the managers is also applicable to the union leaders, because I'm talking about things that can help build the relationship and help negotiations, regardless of which side you're representing. And then one other comment, just about everything I'm talking about today, I've also written about in the book Radical Collaboration that Nicole just spoke to you about. And I want you to know how proud I am that the book has just come out in Spanish. So it's probably not available for sale yet, but we just have the initial copies. So I'm very pleased with the way that turned out. So it will be available soon. If you want to get more information about it, that would be a good place to take a look. So what I thought I would do today is give you comments in a number of different categories, sort of walking through the process. I'll start with talking about building the relationship, because so much of the effective labor management relationships, and by effective, I mean that they were getting the job done without a lot of conflict, without a lot of litigation. So much of those effective relationships were based upon the strength of their relationship, not just their skill level. That was part of it, but part of it was also the strength of their relationship. So I'm going to start with a few things that you could do to help build the relationship. I'm going to talk about some things that you can do when you're planning for negotiations, some tips for what you can do during your negotiations, and then if you happen to get an impasse, if you hit one of those brick walls and you can't get any farther, you can't reach an agreement, what are some things that might be helpful there? And then also after your negotiations, a couple tips for things that you can do to try to set up your next negotiations, so it will be more helpful. And if any of you have any questions, please, I encourage you to write them out and send them to Nicole, because we're going to have some, plenty of time at the end for answering some questions. So let me start with relationship issues. My best advice there is to start building the relationship as soon as you can. Don't wait until you just head into negotiations. You want to start building what we call a green zone environment, meaning it's a more collaborative environment as opposed to a more adversarial or more conflicted working environment. And so to the extent that you can try to build a personal relationship with your counterpart, you're getting to know your counterpart, that's going to be very helpful for you. So, how do you do that? Well, probably the best way is to sit down with your counterpart or counterparts, the whole negotiating team, if you can, and get to know them on a personal level, not just a business level. If you've got a long time, if you've got 6 months before you're going to go into your negotiations, schedule some regular formal meetings over that period of time, trying to get to know each person a little bit better. Try to get to know where they're coming from, what their history is, what their particular needs are, what their underlying interests are, but primarily getting to know them personally, because it was the strength of the personal relationships that help them get through the difficult negotiations for the most part. I encourage you, if you want to have a better working relationship with the union, to be clear and open and direct about the kind of relationship that you want. They're not going to understand that you want a better relationship if you're not clear about that, if you don't go out of your way to make that point. So you have to tell them that. And if they understand what your intentions are, that your intentions are to have a good relationship, then when something happens in the negotiations, somebody makes a mistake or says something that they might not understand, if they have a good understanding that your intention is to have a strong, positive working relationship with them, maybe they'll cut you a little slack and jump to a slightly less harsh assumption about what the meaning of your behavior is. Now, to that end, it's very important that you have the entire leadership team all rowing the boat in the right direction. So if you're the HR director of a company and you're talking to the union about trying to build a more positive, collaborative working relationship with the union, and then you have a plant manager or some other kind of manager or the CEO of the company out talking to the local newspapers about how the union doesn't really represent their members and they don't know what your employees want, or the union is asking, things that are too greedy, you can kiss a good relationship goodbye. So you need to be all on the same message there, that you want to build that positive working relationship. So when you're meeting with your union counterparts, it's important that you avoid doing anything that will invite them to feel insignificant, incompetent, or unlikable. There's been a lot of research showing that you can build a much stronger relationship if the parties feel significant, competent, and likable. So you want to avoid doing anything that makes people feel or invites them to feel insignificant, incompetent, and unlikable. Now, what do I mean by that? By insignificant, I mean you do not want people to feel ignored or not heard or not valued. By incompetent, I mean you do not want people to feel humiliated or bullied or manipulated or helpless in the situation. By unlikable, I mean, you do not want people to feel rejected by you personally or disrespected in any way or simply not likable. But what are some ways of doing this? Well, to help people feel more significant, I encourage people to slow down. If you're with someone, focus your intention exclusively on that other person. Do not be multitasking. You know, if you're meeting with a union leader, stop, pay attention to what you're doing. Don't try and do other things as well, because the message will get diluted that way. Sincerely seek their perspective. What are their thoughts? What are their feelings? What are their underlying interests? You want to acknowledge them for their role, for their expertise, for their past experience, maybe for their leadership experience within the union. Just generally setting a positive tone. Some ways to help people feel competent is to avoid making any unilateral decisions when you could just as easily consult with the other side before you make any decisions. We had a little handy reminder that we used. Now this is in English, but it's ACBD, always consult before deciding. So anytime you're going to be making any kind of a decision, we encourage you to consult with the union ahead of time. We've had some management groups that they wanted to do something very special to build the relationship. In some of the training that we did, we would, instead of having people sitting across the table from each other, we would put them in a semicircle or a circle and intersperse the participants. So it'd be, you know, a union person, a management person, a union person, management person. And then they were all sitting in a group. And so we've had some groups some management groups that really like that. And one in particular, they thought, well, let's set that up ahead of time. And so they went in and they took all the tables out of the room where they were going to be meeting, and they put all the chairs in a circle. And then they went into the meeting early, and they sat in every other chair. And they thought the union.
Wait a minute, Jim. We're not. Wait.
I just got.
We
muted.
lost a few seconds. Yeah.
Okay. So, so they walked into the management team went into the room and they sat in every other chair, thinking that this was going to send a very positive message to the union. And then the union walked in and they looked at the tables were gone and the management people were sitting in every other chair, and they said, you know, what the heck is this? Why are you doing this? You couldn't talk to us about this ahead of time? So even though management had good intentions and they were trying to do something to send a positive message, they would have been much better off by actually talking to the union about it first to see if the union wanted that. So always consult before deciding. Another thing that you can do to increase a feeling of competence is show them that you're open to be influenced.
Recording in progress.
Show them that you're open to be influenced by them. So do not seek to coerce them up. Oh, it's back in progress. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so I said, you know, don't coerce the union, don't bully them, but also don't go to the other extreme and abandon the relationship. I mean, you need to stay in contact with your union counterparts. It is also helpful for you to clarify what your authority is and clarify what their authority is. You do not want to get to the end point in any negotiations on any particular issue, think that you have an agreement and then say, great, let's sign off on that, only to learn that your counterpart doesn't have authority to sign off on that. So you want to try to avoid surprises that way. And then you also want to work together with your counterpart, with the union counterpart, to try to jointly invent creative solutions. So you're not just going in and saying, these are our solutions, now let's hear your solutions. You want to work together with them to see if you can come up with jointly invented solutions. Some ways that you can help people feel likable is demonstrate your understanding of their interests and the context of the situation and their viewpoint. And don't just say, yeah, I understand, I understand. Tell them what you understand. Show them that you really do understand it. Show appreciation for their effort, what their thinking is, what their ideas are, what their attitudes are. You want to be candid and caring and as authentic as you can be. If people get triggered, they get defensive, then I encourage people to be willing to take some time out to let people cool down a little bit. So if it's going in a bad direction, you want to stop it at that point so it doesn't get worse. Don't let small problems get out of hand and turn into bigger problems. And then ahead of time, you want to both prepare and then ask questions of inquiry rather than justification. In other words, you're going to ask questions like, well, help me understand why you blah, 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 why you need this or what your thinking is on that. Can you walk me through your thinking on this particular issue to show that you really do value what they're saying and that you are open to their influence. So those are a few tips for building the relationship. For planning your negotiations, it's helpful if you can have conversations ahead of time about what information is going to be helpful, what's going to be relevant, what are the rules that you want to follow during your negotiations. And you want to reach out and try to get some agreement on ground rules regarding relationships. That would be things like, how you're going to behave in the meeting. One person talks at a time. You're going to attack the problem, not the people. Seek first to understand before you try to be understood. Honor the agenda. Show up on time so you're not keeping people waiting. Those kinds of things. Those are relationship type issues. But then you also want to talk in more detail about process issues. Like, will you have a facilitator? Or will you take turns running the meetings? What's the timing going to be? Are you going to meet on a regular basis for 2 or 3 hours, or do you go as long as the meeting is going to be productive? What information is relevant? This is a big deal because there's a lot of information out there. For example, in just about every negotiation, both parties come to the table with wage and salary studies, trying to prove their point. But a lot of the wage and salary studies out there are simply not relevant. If you're in heavy manufacturing, coming in with a wage and salary study that talks about what people are paid in a fast food restaurant, that isn't going to be helpful to your negotiations. So if you can have conversations ahead of time about what information is relevant and then make a joint search to try to figure out how to get that information and how you're going to share that information, that's going to be helpful. Another thing to talk about is how you'll handle caucuses. A lot of times the relationship was put in jeopardy and really tested when one side or the other would take caucuses all the time. They'd come to the meeting and 10 minutes later, they'd want to take a caucus. And then they would go off and meet with their own team for 45 minutes and leave the other team sitting there. That just infuriates people. So if you're going to have caucuses, try to keep them short. And what we encouraged parties to do was anytime you had to take a caucus, meaning a separate meeting by yourself with your own team, tell the other side why you needed that. And then when you come back, give them an update. Well, yeah, we had a good discussion about X, Y, and Z, whatever it was, and that was very helpful to us. So the other team isn't left wondering whether you're just off in the other room playing cards or having coffee. What you're really trying to do is develop mutual expectations so there are no surprises when you get into your negotiation. You want all the parties in agreement about what's the process that you're going to follow. Okay, some tips during the negotiation. Probably the most important thing is it is very important for you to put more energy into trying to understand the underlying interest of all the parties. Typically, what happens in most labor negotiations is somebody comes in, one side comes in and they make a proposal. Usually it's the union makes a proposal. Sometimes management makes a proposal. And then there's a counteroffer, and there's a counteroffer to that and a counteroffer to that. And they don't spend a lot of time ahead of time before they make their proposals talking about what their underlying needs are. So I'm suggesting that before you go about making any proposals, that you spend a lot more time trying to really understand what the underlying needs are of both parties. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is try to not move on to the next process. Don't start making proposals until each party could articulate the point of view of the other party to the other party's satisfaction. So if I was doing a mediation of a labor management group, I would call the parties in and I would say, well, I want to learn about management's point of view on this particular issue, but I don't want to learn it from management. I want to learn it from the union. And so I would have the union explain it to me. And of course, they'd usually, get part of it right and part of it wrong. And then I'd ask management to educate the union a little bit, tell them more about it. And the union, I'd have them take another stab at it. And they would get a little bit closer. And we'd have to go back and forth several times until finally the union could say what management's position was, what their point of view was on this particular issue, to the satisfaction of management, that management really did believe that the union understood the management position. Then I would reverse the roles, and I would have the management try to explain to me the union's position, and we go through the same process. And I wouldn't let them move on to the next stage, of giving proposals to each other until they both were clear that they understood each other's point of view. Now, a lot of times there was a real hesitancy to do that simply because people were fearful that if they articulated the other side's point of view, that meant that they agreed with it. And that's not at all what I'm suggesting here. I'm saying you have to understand their point of view. You don't have to agree with it. So you can say, well, here's what I think your point of view is, and then you spell that out. And if that's correct, then you can say, now I have a different point of view. So I'd like to share my point of view with you now because we see this issue a little bit differently. But if you can create that understanding, that's going to go a long way to finding better solutions. At the start of any negotiation, at the start of any meeting, at the start of any phone call, it is also worth your while to set a positive tone, one of these, what we call the green zone tone. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it's, welcoming each other, rebuilding that personal relationship. When we do negotiation simulations or when I've done mediations, and people will spend 2 or 3 minutes trying to build that positive tone, I always ask the parties, was that helpful to them? And in just about every situation that I can remember, the parties say, yeah, that was very helpful at creating that positive environment. And they only spend 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes at the most. So it is a very worthwhile use of time. It's a great investment to try to start things off in a positive tone. Then you want to make sure that you're there to solve the same problem. And that you're both working on the same issue. I had one case in Oakland, California, where they'd been negotiating, the union and the management had been negotiating for 2.5 years and not been able to reach an agreement, and it ended up in litigation. So I was mediating them, and I asked the parties to go explain, go up to a flip chart and explain the problem. And one of the negotiators, I forget whether it was the union or management, went up and spent about 20 minutes on a flip chart doing a very detailed analysis of the problem. And when she was done, the other negotiator looked at her and said, "What in the heck are you talking about? That's not the problem." Now, they'd been negotiating for 2.5 years and had never had that conversation. So you want to make sure that you're there to solve the same problem. Because if you can't reach an agreement on what the problem is, you will never reach an agreement on the possible solution. Now, in most of your negotiations, you're going to have this offer counter offer situation where one party makes an offer and the other party makes a counter offer. We changed that pretty dramatically when we were doing training on this new interest-based process. I'm assuming you're still going to be following that system, because that's what happens most of the place, where somebody makes an offer, somebody makes a counter offer. So I'm not pushing to make any changes there, and that's what I'm not going to be talking about that specifically today. But if you want to find out more about that when we get to the question and answer period, I'll talk about that. It's not something that I would encourage people to do unless they have some mutual training with the parties. But there are some techniques that you can do. For example, making sure that you understand the interest and be able to articulate it, like I mentioned earlier. That's probably the single most important thing that you could do. Probably another thing that's very important is to make a joint search, a mutual search for any objective criteria. Objective criteria are things that will add legitimacy to any of the proposals that people are making. You can have objective standards or objective processes, objective procedures. An objective standard might be a wage and salary study. You know, what are other industries that are similar to yours in the same area? What are they paying their employees? An objective procedure would be, if you both have legitimate interest, how could you resolve that? So an example of an objective procedure might be using seniority if you have to have a layoff. You know, the most senior people get to stay. They're the last people out the door. The newer employees are the ones that go out the door first. And what those do, if you have objective criteria, it gives both parties a sense of legitimacy that this is a fair solution because it's outside the control of either party. So some general guidelines about if you're in negotiations and you're inventing possible solutions. Number one, I encourage people to be very firm about getting their interests met. When I'm talking about being more collaborative, I'm not suggesting that you should give up easier, that you shouldn't be trying to get your interests met. Quite the opposite. You should be absolutely very strong and tenacious about getting your interests met. But if you really understand what all the interests are of the parties, there's usually lots of different ways that you can get those interests met. So I encourage you, when you're thinking about solutions, to be firm about getting your interests met, but be very flexible about how you get them met. And I always look to a three-step process when I'm thinking of what solutions might be. I try to always be looking for mutual gains. How can any solution help both parties? The first step is, if your interests are the same, reach agreement on that right away. Use that to start the negotiations rolling. You know, don't hold back. If the other side is proposing something that's also meets your interest, reach agreement on that. Sometimes parties, they won't do something that's in their own best interest to do simply because it benefits the other side, and they're trying to get something from the other side for that. So that is not a good message to send to the other side if you won't do something that's in your own best interest to do simply because it benefits the other side. So if your interests are the same, reach agreement on them right away. If your interests are not the same, Then see if you can fit them together in a way that they work together. For example, the co-author of the book, Ron Luet, he hates to travel. I love to travel. So our interests are very different, but they fit very well together in our business. So if there's a workshop in Mexico City or Paris or Singapore, I'm the one that does it. If it's in San Francisco or Los Angeles, Ron's the one that does it. Okay, so we have different interests, but they fit together very well. That's the second step. The third step is if your interests can't be dovetailed, they're separate, they're not the same, and they don't fit together very well, then I encourage parties to look to see, is there a way that you can get your interests met, at least without doing any damage to the other side's interests? An example of this, there was one case where the state government was offering matching funds if the union and the management would come and ask for them together, if they reached an agreement on it. But the union had promised their members that they wouldn't go down that road, that they wouldn't ask for that because it was something that a lot of the members didn't want. I don't remember what the issue was, but the union had made a promise to their members that they weren't going to do that. So instead of going together and getting all the money, with labor and management going together and asking for it jointly, management was able to go and without the union's permission or without the union's acceptance of it, they were able to get like 75% of the money. And that way the union didn't have to agree. So they were willing to take a lesser amount of money, and it protected the union's interest. It protected the union's promise that they had made to their members. So it didn't do any damage to the union. So exploit mutual interests, dovetail those that are different if you can. And if you can't do that, get your interest met without damaging the other side's interest. The next tip is just the classic rules of brainstorming. And that would be separate the inventing process from the judging or the evaluating process anytime you're trying to find solutions. So we would have just classic brainstorming rules when we would get the two negotiating teams together. And we'd say, all right, here's the problem that we're working on. Let's just do some brainstorming. And we would have a facilitator up in the front of the room taking down any ideas. And they would just go around the room and people would throw out wild and crazy ideas focused on that issue. Then as a separate process, they would go back through and do the evaluation. How many interests does this meet? Does this meet the interests of both parties? Is it better than what we can do on our own? They kept that as a separate process. And that's helpful because we're all under so much pressure at the bargaining table typically that if we're evaluating the possible solutions as someone is suggesting it, then usually as soon as we find one that works, we'll agree with it. And so we end up with the first solution rather than the best solution. So separate those two processes. Also, don't assume a fixed pie. In any negotiations, there's really two parts to the negotiations. One is called creating value, and then the other is called distributing value. And most parties put more energy onto distributing value, claiming value. I want this much of what's available. But it's going to be more helpful if they can put more energy into trying to make the pie bigger. So when they divide the pie, each party gets a bigger share. So sometimes working together to try to get matching funds from a local government or the federal government is a great example. A simple little example is if you're negotiating with a friend about where to go to lunch, and you're thinking about just lunch today, and your friend wants to go to the Las Colorinas, and you want to go to the Italian restaurant, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. You're going to pick one. But if instead of negotiating over where you're going to go to lunch just today, if you talk about where you're going to go to lunch for the next 3 or 4 times, you have a lot more room to maneuver. You know, you could go to the Las Colorinas this time, and you could go to the Italian place next time, and then you can go to a different restaurant the next time. So if you can create a larger pie to negotiate, you have a much greater chance of reaching some solutions. We encourage you to put as much energy into solving the problem of the other party as you put into solving the problems of yourself. And usually in negotiations, not usually, often in negotiations, what we'll hear from one party is, hey, that's their problem. You know, they're going to have to deal with that. That is not a way to build a strong collaborative working relationship. The other party needs to know that you're trying to solve their problems as well. There has to be some level of reciprocity in there. It doesn't have to be perfect. You know, it doesn't have to be, yeah, I'll do exactly this if you do exactly that. But there has to be some sense on both parties that the other side is trying to help them solve their problems. Let's see, I talked about objective standards or fair procedures. That adds legitimacy. And then also be willing to negotiate over process-related issues as well as substantive issues if you get into a bind. An example of that was I was working with United Airlines in a negotiation, advising them in a negotiations where they were trying to buy one of their original airplanes. When they first opened the United Airlines, they had somebody else that owned that airplane now. That person wanted to sell the airplane to United Airlines so they could put it in one of their museums. United Airlines wanted to buy the airplane, but they couldn't agree on a price, and they got stuck. They were just at a deadlock there. And so the suggestion was stop negotiating over what the price is, and negotiate over how you would find a fair price. So they changed the negotiation into a process instead of a price, a process of how to find a legitimate, fair price. And by doing that, they came up with a bunch of different perspectives of looking at it, and they were eventually able to do that. All right, those are some general guidelines for creating some solutions. Some more very specific methods that I found very helpful for creating solutions are brainstorming, which I talked about earlier. That's probably the one that we've used the most. Another one that I find is very helpful for labor negotiations is something that's called fractionating, or dividing a single issue into as many parts as possible, so you have more room for trade-offs or compromises. Usually where this comes in as being helpful is when you're talking about wages. Almost always the sticking point for most labor negotiations is wages. And oftentimes that's the last thing that they get to. And so they've done a lot of give and take and a lot of compromise and a lot of trade-offs before they get to the issue of wages. So they don't have any more trade-offs or more compromises that they can do. So we would say, instead of just negotiating, looking this as one issue of wages, divide that single issue into as many parts as possible. If you can divide that into 10 smaller parts, then you might have room for trade-off. So we would say, well, is it going to be an increase for 1 year or for 6 months? Because you could give a 10% wage increase over 6 months, or a 5% wage increase over a full year, and you're spending the same amount of money, although there are big differences in the ongoing cost there. But it's how do you want to allocate the money? That's one issue. Another issue could be an equal distribution among all employees, or maybe you skew it a little bit and you give more money to people who are getting ready to retire, because it would encourage them to retire if you're trying to cut back on your workforce. Or maybe you put more money at the lower end of the salary scale to try to attract newer employees into the system because you're having a hard time recruiting. Another issue might be, does the increase, does it go on your salary scale as a permanent fixture, or is it a one-time bonus? A lot of times the management teams felt that, well, they had enough money to give this kind of money, you know, a certain amount of money, but they were worried that they wouldn't have enough money to pay that next year. So they would give it to the employees as a one-time bonus rather than increasing the salary scale. Sometimes they would say, well, we want to give you an increase, but we don't have the money to do it. So what other ways could we do that? So maybe they would give some kind of other value, like they would give time off, or they would give educational support. They would pay for courses. They would maybe give discounts on company products that they made. And they could give something that the employees would value also, but it wouldn't cost the company nearly as much. Reframing the particular issue and seeing how many different ways you can describe the problem is a way of coming up with some creative solutions sometimes. My favorite story here was there was an employee, I heard this on National Public Radio. This is a true story. There was an employee who loved his job, loved the company he worked for, was paid well, was a very creative job, really enjoyed everything about the job except for one thing. He couldn't stand his boss. And so he was going to quit just to get away from that boss, because he said, you know, I can't do this anymore. I have to get away from the boss. And so he made that decision. He was going to go to a recruiting firm and look for a new job. And he went home that night and he was talking to his wife, and his wife had been teaching a class about creativity at a local community college. And she helped him reframe his problem from how do I get away from the boss to how can I get the boss away from me? And so the next morning, instead of taking his resume into the recruiting firm, he took his boss's resume into the recruiting firm, and he hired the recruiting firm to find a new job for his boss. And it took, I don't know, several months, I guess. And finally, the recruiting firm found a good job that they thought his boss would like. And they made a cold call to the boss and said, hey, your name was given to us. We have a job. We wonder if you're interested. It was a good job for the boss. He got a promotion out of it, and he left the company. Not only did it got him away from the employee, but it allowed for the employee to be promoted into that boss's job. So just reframing the problem from how do I get away from the boss to how do I get the boss away from me led to an entirely different solution. Another great example of this was there was the priest that went in and asked the bishop, is it okay if I smoke while I pray? And the bishop was very offended and said, no, that's not good at all. And another priest went in and asked the bishop, is it okay if I pray while I smoke? Of course, no problem at all. It's exactly the same issue, but how they describe it, they came to a very different solution. Something else that has been helpful is companies that have large workforces, where they have a lot of creativity they could tap into. They would come up with something called a wish list, and they would just send out in an employee newsletter, here's a problem that we have. Who has ideas about solving that? And they would ask the employees for possible solutions, and they could get some really creative solutions that way. The U.S. Forest Service, I think it was the eastern part of the United States, they had an employee suggestion system there, where employees could make suggestions for improving things. And over several years, they got 63 suggestions each year, roughly about that much. They made one single change to try to increase the number of suggestions by taking those suggestions more seriously. And in the next year, they got 6,000. So they went from 63 up to 6,000. And it didn't cost them any money at all. They had no financial incentives. What they told the employees was, if someone doesn't get back to you within 30 days on your suggestion, then you can automatically implement that suggestion on your own, as long as it's something legal. As long as it's not illegal, then you can go ahead and do it. And all of a sudden, the employees felt more empowered to make suggestions that were valuable, and that went from 63 up to 6,000. So they really were able to tap into the creativity of those employees. Sometimes we'll play what's known as what if games. You know, if you're facing a 10% budget cut, instead of looking how to come up with a 10% cut, have a conversation about, well, what would happen if we had to cut 50% or 25%? And you might get a different perspective on what your priorities are there. You know, what might happen? What if we merge these two departments? Or what if COVID goes on for 10 years? How might we behave? You know, what could we do in our company for the workforce if COVID is there for 10 years? And sometimes just thinking, what if, these very different scenarios can come up with creative solutions. Also look for differences. Oftentimes we're looking for that perfect fit, but sometimes if you have differences, different kinds of differences can lead to different types of solutions. For example, if you have a different skills, maybe you combine things. I had a partner once, and we were building a house or remodeling a house. And what we learned from that was that I love things like using a chainsaw and a sledgehammer. I am not a small finesse person. I like the big, tear down projects and big rebuilding projects. My partner loved the paintbrush and the chisel and did the more detailed stuff. So we combined our skills and it was a good match. If you have a difference in time preference, you can alternate things. My daughter was a morning person, my son was a night person. They shared a bathroom. So one would take a shower in the morning, one would take a shower at night to get ready for school the next day. Another example that we see in labor negotiations a lot is a different probability and risk assessments. So in a lot of negotiations, the union would come in and say, every year you say that you don't have any money left and the budget is broke, and yet you always end up with a big surplus at the end of every year. And management will come in and say, well, yes, but that was different, and this year it's going to be really tight, so we can't give a raise. They have a difference in the probability or the risk assessment of the size of the ending balance. So if you have that, then you could do a proposal like, well, if the ending balance is this big, if it's a large ending balance, then we're going to implement plan A. If it's a small ending balance, then we're going to implement plan B. A difference in risk assessment. All right, let's see. A couple other cautionary notes, and maybe a couple other tools. One cautionary note, no one wants to have even a good proposal implemented unilaterally. So go back and remember that the ACBD, always consult before deciding. Don't make any unilateral changes where you could actually consult ahead of time. Another tool is something called the worst critic analysis. Oftentimes, one side or the other would make a proposal and the receiving side would say, oh, I can't do that. They would be thinking this among themselves. I can't do that because part of my constituency is going to be very upset. They're going to criticize me if I agree on that. So when you're making a proposal, if you can be thinking about who is going to criticize the other side if they agree to this. Then you try to come up with arguments to help that other side deal with that criticism. Bill Urey, the author, one of the authors of the book Getting to Yes, he calls this building a golden bridge to cross. You know, you help your counterpart agree to what you want by giving them strong arguments that will help your counterpart deal with their own worst critic. And then finally, as a closure tool, oftentimes we would encourage the parties to have a long discussion about what are all the interests and what are all the possible solutions that you've analyzed. And as you're just going through each of the possible solutions, talking about which interest that meets or which interest it doesn't meet, and how it compares to what you're going to do if you can't reach an agreement. And usually what happens while you're having that conversation, you can get a sense of, if you put together a package deal, you know, maybe if we add a little of this and we do some of that, we don't do that part, we piggyback this on top of that, we might have some kind of a plan that might work. Then we would have a joint team of, you know, a smaller team of the labor management groups work together to go off and write that up. And then they come back and they bring it back to the group. They're not asking for the group to approve it at that point. They're saying, based on our earlier conversation, we think this might be a possible solution, but we want to know, are there ways that we can improve it? We're not asking you to approve it, but can we improve it? And then they would get feedback. Then they would go back and they would have to rewrite the proposal based on the feedback, and they would bring it back to the group. And as long as they keep getting ways of improving it, they would keep going back and rewriting it and bringing it back to the group. When they couldn't rewrite it anymore to make it any better, then they would ask the group to approve it. We call this a straw design. It's a straw design because it's not made of concrete, it's made of straw. And so you can shoot, you know, like you a bale of hay that you shoot those arrows into, archery. So it's not cast in concrete, it can change. All right, so then what happens if you get stuck? What are some tips for breaking an impasse? Because I can promise you this, there is no relationship or no method of negotiation that's going to guarantee success in every time, especially if you're talking about a labor management relationship, because each side usually has strong constituencies. But before you give up and before you resort to your worst case scenario by taking unilateral action or going out on strike or whatever your worst case scenario might be, here are some possible ways of dealing with impasses that I found to be helpful. Sometimes we would get the parties together and just do a joint review of what all of their interests were and talk about any shared vision of success. You know, what would it be like in this company if we could actually reach an agreement, if we could have a good relationship? What would that look like? And oftentimes that can inspire people to you know, make those final differences a little bit smaller. Look for undiscovered or undisclosed interests as well. If you've come up with a proposal that seems to meet all of the objectives of the other side, and the other side is still saying no, then that's a red flag that there's some interest there that either they're not sharing with you or they may not be aware of. So, and I think the best way to deal with that is deal with it directly. Say, look, we've come up with a proposal that seems to meet every single one of your interests and every one of your objections, and you're still saying no. So help us understand what the problem is, because we seem to have met all of your objectives. Now, sometimes it's because the parties don't understand that there's some other interest there. They just haven't paid attention to them. They know something's not right. So by asking those kinds of questions, you can help the other party discover what those interests are. that they haven't paid attention to so far. Sometimes it's because the other party doesn't want to tell you. If that's the case, then I think you need to push on them and say, look, we're not going to be able to reach an agreement here if you can't share the information about what your problems are with this. So deal with it more directly. Also, if you get stuck, I encourage people to go back and look at what their contingency plans are. In other words, what's their plan B? What are they going to do if they can't reach an agreement? For the union, oftentimes that's a strike. For management, oftentimes it's unilaterally implementing the changes without the union's agreement. Or maybe just doing nothing, not increasing wages or whatever it might be. But I encourage you to go back and look at your contingency plan and see what the impact of that is going to be on the stability of this union management relationship. Because a lot of times management would think, well, we'll either just implement the changes that we want or we won't do anything at all, and that'll show the union, that they're powerless. And they vastly underrated the creativity of the union members to cause problems for the company. A classic example of this is something called work to rule, where if management unilaterally implements some changes, the employees decide to follow the rule book, and they will only do exactly what they're told to do. And in most companies, that's one of the worst ways that you can screw up the effectiveness of a company, is by only doing exactly what they're told to do and nothing more. Or they're following every single rule exactly the way it's written, because usually rules aren't that good, and people, work around rules to make things work. And so if employees only work to rule, it's going to cause a big problem for the management teams. Let's see. Looking at for patterns to see where you've been successful or where you haven't been successful. That can be helpful. If you're a big, global company, and you realize that, and your plants at say San Luis Potosi or Cuernavaca, you've been able to find solutions in every single one of those, but your plant in Mexico City, you never seem to find solutions there. It doesn't work there. Well, what's the difference? What's the pattern there? Is it the leadership? Is it management? Is it the employees? Is it some processes that aren't working there? What's the pattern there? So where you've been successful and where you've been unsuccessful. Another thing you can do is take a look at the forces that impact either your success or your failure. We call this a force field analysis, where we'll say, all right, if you want to move from point A to point B, whatever that is, maybe that's just to reach a new contract. What are the forces that encourage that movement? And what are the forces that work against that movement? And you have two lists. And then you go to the list of the forces that are working against you, and you look at each particular item on that list, and you say, what can we do to try to minimize the impact that this has on our success? And then we go to the list of the things that help you move in that direction. And you say, what can we do to increase the influence of each and everything that's on that list? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to change the amount of force that you have there. So you want to encourage those things that help you get there and discourage those things that work against you. A pilot project can be very helpful as well. Oftentimes, if you're not quite sure how things are going to turn out, but you want to try some new processes, trying a pilot project can be very helpful. Say, well, we'll try it for 6 months and see what happens. The key to a successful pilot project, though, is knowing what's going to happen at the end of that pilot project when that time is up. So what you want to avoid is a situation where one party thinks, all right, we're going to implement this new process, and at the end of that 6-month period, unless we agree to go back to the original way, it's going to stay the same. And the other party thinks, well, at the end of that 6-month period, we're automatically going to go back to the old way unless we agree on it staying the new way. So you want to avoid those kinds of problems. And then the last thing you can do, which we did fairly often in labor negotiations in California, is bring in third parties to help with the negotiations. And you could bring in people for substantive help or process help. Substantive help, an example of that would be in California school districts, there are very few people in the state. It's such a complex issue to figure out how much money each school district is going to get, that very few people in the United States could actually figure that out. And so anytime we were getting in a strike or getting close to impasse, we would bring in somebody from the Department of Education, a finance expert from the Department of Education, to sit down with the parties to help them figure out how much money they could actually have for the following year. So that's where you're bringing in substantive help. Process help would be like when they're bringing in me as a mediator to go back and forth between the parties and exchange proposals and help them be more creative and things like that. But I didn't know about school finance, so we had to bring in somebody that could help us on school finance. So that's the difference between substantive and process help. And then after negotiations, if you do reach an agreement, you want to be careful about how you talk about it. I've had some situations where we reached an agreement, where we're out on strike. We reach agreement at 2 o'clock in the morning. Nobody gets everything they want, but everybody gets enough to agree to the proposal. And then I get up the next morning and I read on the front page of one of the local newspapers, one side or the other saying, wow, we won. We really beat them. We kicked their butt. We got everything we wanted. And I'm thinking, you idiots, don't you know that you're going to be sitting across the table from these same people? Do you think they're not going to remember that? Well, of course they are. So you're much better off communicating it in a way that supports that relationship. Instead of saying, yeah, we beat the other side, communicate something that says, yeah, this was a very difficult negotiation. Not everybody got everything they wanted, but we think this is a good result. We both got enough to make it work. And so we're very supportive of the process. That's a way of trying to set it up to make your negotiations easier the next time you go around. And then you also want to make sure, as you're signing off on an agreement, that you have both clarity and commitment. You have to have a clear agreement where you know what people are going to do, what's expected of them, what's going to happen if it doesn't happen. How will you know if it doesn't happen? It's all of those crossing the T's and dotting the I's of your agreement. You have to have clarity if you want it to stand the test of time. And then also you need a commitment. Sometimes that can be a handshake on a single deal, a grievance, or it could be a 100-page document of a contract. But you have to have both clarity and commitment. All right, so those are some tips that I would give to parties just heading into negotiations. So, Nicole, what kind of questions do we have now? And I can't hear you. I still can't hear. Am I the only one? No. Okay.
Hi, Jim. I can
there.
jump in.
Okay.
I had a question, but since Nicole is having some difficulties, I can say it to you. So my name is Roberto, and my question to you is, do you have any feedback you can provide us regarding gender gap salary? I know this has been an ongoing issue throughout various corporations. So I'm not sure if you have been involved in some of these disputes, and if you have, how did you address it, and what was the outcome from this topic?
Typically, yeah, okay, good question. Typically, I have not been, but it's more of an issue now, I think, than it has been in the past. It's a tough thing to address. I think probably the best way would be to try to figure out jointly with the union, put together a joint study with the union to try to, first of all, address what the differences are. Because usually, in my experience, the difference has not been straightforward that they pay females less. It's that the females are in the more entry-level jobs, and they haven't moved up into the more professional level jobs. So it has more to do with how to move the female employees into those jobs, which requires training. It requires identifying who has the skills to move into those jobs more than actually paying people. I don't think it's particularly effective to say, well, we have differences in gender pay, and therefore we're going to need to pay women more. I think that's just going to infuriate the workforce in general. It doesn't seem particularly fair. What you need to do is figure out how to get the females into the more highly skilled, higher paying jobs. And the best way to do that is to get the union on board ahead of time.
Yeah, no, and the question arises, Jim, because as you mentioned, there is a lack of female involvement in some of the chair level, right? So
yeah,
that's why I asked.
So one of the things that you could try to do is see if you can get union sponsorship for a separate committee that's different than the negotiating committee. In the pilot project that we did in California, I'm pretty certain that one of the reasons we were so successful is that we were starting in school districts. And in school districts, there is a significantly higher proportion of female leadership than there is in industry. And I think that we had a higher level of collaborative skills as a result of that. And there was less inequality on gender issues, just because there's so much more representation there. So if you go into the typical industrial union setting, you're probably going to find a much smaller representation of females on the bargaining committee. So maybe what you need to do is propose to the union that you don't use the bargaining committee for that, that you come up with a separate ad hoc committee that's made up of at least 50-75% females. That's an issue that you're dealing with. It's hard to deal with that if you have 90% of the people on the commission who's studying it, or the team who's studying it, are males. So don't rely on the typical bargaining structure. Try and set up some other process, some other team, and they can make proposals to the bargaining teams for them to consider. But I think you'll probably come up with more creative solutions if you do it separate and apart. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jim, for your answer. And well, I was saying that, that you have given us a lot of information and a lot of insights, so thank you for that. And we have another question that is, you have talked about some key points about when you get stuck, but Karina asked us, what do you suggest when we need to collaborate with people on the company that only want to win and take advantage for themselves? And Santiago adds, also when you have prepared yourself in a very collaborative way and you face the other part that is prepared with a thorough request sheet and with a rigid win-lose attitude.
Yeah. Well, First of all, I would name what you're faced with and talk about it openly. But being collaborative does not necessarily mean that you're not going to be forceful. It's possible to say to somebody who's being rigidly non-collaborative, this is not acceptable behavior. You know, we need to figure out a way to deal with this problem. Otherwise, it's not going to be solved. And here's what the consequences are going to be. I mean, we've had unions that have been willing to go out on strike when management gets rigid. You know, we're not going to listen to what your proposals are. We're not going to make any changes. We like the way it is. We want to be in total control. And you know, the union has a way of punishing that kind of behavior. Management has the same ability to punish rigid union behavior. You know, they don't have to agree to it. It makes it more difficult for everybody. But I would encourage you to be talking about the rigidity, seeing if there are people within the other side, if there are people on the other bargaining team where you can build personal relationships that have more flexibility. Try to communicate through those people. But if you're talking about someone in a strong leadership position, you need to be very careful about trying to go around that person. I mean, you do need to deal with the person who is in the leadership role, because otherwise you're liable to get in trouble legally by trying to, you know, undermine the union or bargaining in bad faith with management. Try to spend more time talking about what the underlying interests are of the parties, of the person who's very rigid. You know, help me better understand. I might go along with what you're proposing, but I need to understand why. You know, what do you hope to accomplish here? How is this going to work? And you keep asking a lot more questions to try to get more information about that. Because it may be that there are other ways that you can accomplish the same thing if you can get them to be talking about what their underlying interests are. And if you may have better luck doing that if you're talking to the negotiating team rather than talking to a single person.
Yes, thank you. I think that's very useful. And well, another question, Roberto asked us, can you share some outcomes about using all these techniques that you have experienced, like about the growth of the company or the agreement they reached with about salary examples or any example about that? Sure.
The main study, we've had several different studies. The main one shows that trust goes up dramatically. The people who believe their working relationships are conflicted and adversarial drops dramatically. People are clearly more creative. On one study that was done by the University of California's Institute of Industrial Relations, they went through and they looked at they did a survey of all the participants who went through this program for the first year and a half. And the program was the one I was talking about earlier that was funded by the state of California and the Hewlett Foundation, where we were teaching both unions and management. We would train them together in a very intensive training about negotiating and building relationships. And one study from the University of California showed not only were they using their relationship to come up with more creative solutions, but they were solutions that both parties agreed were better and would last longer. So they not only came up with solutions faster, but they were better, more creative solutions. And what we found, one of the biggest problems we had was people who were in leadership roles in those organizations, they kept getting promoted away, because usually they were organizations that had a huge amount of conflict. And then we would teach them these collaborative skills, and they would be publicized, and they would see that the contracts were good, solid contracts. Oftentimes they weren't the highest paid contracts, but they were usually up in the top 20%. Most of the organizations, what they wanted was, they wanted to be in the upper quartile of pay. Most of the unions were happy with that. Most of the management said, as long as we can do that, we can still attract good employees. So they were almost never at the bottom of the pay scale there. So they had good, solid agreements. They were able to attract new members. One of the things that they were successful at doing also was they would train the new people coming into the organization. So whenever somebody in a leadership role would leave, they had someone to fill their spot too, and they could keep the continuity. One of the things that got some organizations into trouble was they would build a strong relationship between the leadership people, like the president of the school board, the superintendent of the schools, and the teachers union representative. They would have a strong personal relationship, and they would base their negotiations on just that personal relationship. And then when one of them left, the relationship dissolved. So the successful teams also figured out how to get more people trained so they could fill in the slots. So they were changing the culture of the organization as well as improving the personal relationship. But conflict went down. We reduced the amount of conflict, just an enormous amount. This 67%. This was in 100 different organizations over a 3.5-year period. And the conflict was very expensive. If people would have to go into an unfair labor practice hearing, and they were both represented by lawyers, it would drag on for a year or two, and it just created chaos in an organization when they had that kind of conflict. So if they could eliminate that, it really changed the nature, the culture that people were performing in, and everybody seemed to like it so much better. Oftentimes, management was more willing to go into that training than the unions were, because the unions were concerned that the union leadership was concerned that they had been elected to go in and fight with management. They saw that as their job, to go in and fight for the rights of the employees. What they learned, though, over the years was, if they could get the same results in a less toxic environment, less poisonous, less arguing, less fighting, the employees loved it. Their membership loved it if they could have a more collaborative environment and still get the same benefits. So a lot of the union leaders went from being, really hard adversarial leaders to being much more collaborative, much more skilled at collaboration in those areas where management also wanted to make it work. They could still be the hard-nosed, hammered, pounding on the table in those areas where management was reacting the same way. But generally speaking, it had a very positive impact on the working relationships. They did a better job of solving the problems. They came up with more creative solutions. They lasted longer. Employees were happier. The benefits were typically higher. It was just a win-win for everybody. And it's hard work. The system, the labor management system, is actually designed to pit unions against management and management against unions in most situations. And it's not easy to overcome that. It takes a lot of hard work and paying a lot of attention to it. And one of the things that we would encourage people is, if you're not going to make a long-term commitment to it, don't start it, because it's a little like dancing with a bear. You know, it's easy to start, but it's hard to stop. And if you want to stop dancing with a bear, you're going to cause a lot of problems. So if management would start this process of saying, well, we want to be more cooperative and more collaborative with the unions, and then when things get tough, they abandon it, it just is going to make things so much worse. The union will never trust management. So unless you're willing to hang in there and you know, put a lot of effort into it, we encourage people not to try it, because you'll just make things worse. But it is very rewarding when you see that happen. I mean, I had some places where I was mediating strikes, and then the next year, after they'd had a year of working on collaborative relationships, I'd go back in, they would invite me back in to observe their negotiations, and you couldn't tell who was representing the union and who was representing management, because both parties were talking about, you know, how can we improve the environment here? How can we better protect the rights and the roles of teachers? How can we bring the classified employees, their pay up? You know, how can we add more to the community? And both sides wanted to do that. Both sides wanted to educate kids better in school districts. So it was just a wonderful thing when you could see how they had gone from being out on strike to working cooperatively together.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope with all these, not just techniques, but outcomes, a lot of people want to have a more collaborative culture in their organizations or in their relationships.
Yeah.
And well, Paul, because of the time, Paul will
let
give
me
us
try. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just let me try if I can do it. It's a little bit noisy here where I am, but Jim, it has been so much of value, and we at Consultoría Más are profoundly honored by you, Jim, sharing your knowledge, your experience with this community. I hope we can do this again in the near future. Thank you very much, my friend. I would also like to thank all the team in Consultoría Más for making this possible, especially Nicole, Pau, Mariana, Fernanda, who were working closely with this. And we are also profoundly grateful with our clients and colleagues for making the time to invest on yourselves and on your organization's welfare. So, of course, I'm inviting you all who are listening to this conference right now or in the subtitle version that we are going to be sending to you, to open the conversation on how we can help to create an even more collaborative culture inside your organization. There's us at Consultoría Más, and there's a network of trainers in Mexico that can do this. So thank you very much to you all.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what you just said, Paul. You're very fortunate in that you do have people that are trained in this and trained well. So there you have people that you can call on for help there. So you know who to call. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a pleasure for me.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Pleasure is ours. Thank you.
Okay.